Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction that tends to focus on a combination of low life and high tech. Cyberpunk bloomed in the 80s as a new wave of science fiction, a dystopian neon setting defined by a corporate greed with protagonists who are outsiders to the system. The genre resonated throughout the world, spearheaded by works such as Blade Runner or Neuromancer. Not to mention techno-orientalism. Cyberpunk is often critiqued for its use of Asia as an exotic backdrop, especially during the period where Japan was on the rise. There was a lot of fear of its techno-supremacy.
The thing that was very smart about Ridley Scott was most English-speaking people aren't going to know what it says, but in those characters, it becomes visually very, very important. If you could read it, your eye would go to it and you'd be distracted. You would be looking at it and reading it, and he doesn't want you looking at it and reading it. He just wants you to be dazzled by how beautiful it is.
And this is not quite Asia as we know it, though. It's usually a pastiche of a pastiche. This is a paper-thin version, a fake version based on whatever stereotypes people knew at the time. Many of these people had never even been to Japan or Asia. Now, on the counterpoint, there were fans in Japan who actually were quite appealed to by this fake image of Japan. This sort of allure of it was there for them. Especially, say, for example, when William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer, was shown around Shibuya for the first time by a young journalist who couldn't help but tell him, you see, it is a Blade Runner town. Despite criticisms, Gibson's novels were actually translated faster than most in Japan, usually because of the new technologies coming at that time, but he was popular. His work definitely appealed to science fiction fans, and Japan itself at that time was definitely a land full of science fiction. And the same thing can be said for animation.
Every one of my generation who was working in the anime industry at that time, whether they were backgrounds or character or even photographers, that they would have been impacted by that film Blade Runner. If you went to any company that specialized in backgrounds, they all had Sid Mead's book.
It's impossible to talk about anime cyberpunk without talking about the broader landscape of Japanese media during this time, as, like most media, it does not live in a vacuum, and most of these animated cyberpunk works are adaptations, especially things like novels or manga, and the mangaka of Japan were really enthralled by the works of Moebius, who himself was a big influence in American cyberpunk. However, Japanese cyberpunk started out a little bit differently, putting the word punk back into the genre. The Japanese film industry was in bad shape at the turn of the 80s. New filmmakers were turning to do-it-yourself mentality and new 8mm cameras to shoot their own films. Goku Ryu Ishii was one of them. His early projects found him the attention of Toei, who started funding his films like Burst City. Suddenly, the punk filmmaker who'd rather burn junk than pay for a smoke machine was making hits. Burst City is nonsensical, a post-apocalyptic defined by rebel bikers, a culture that itself would take off in Japan during this period. With its punk bands blasting in the dark neon, the film is visual chaos, but a stepping stone in a broader trend of punk filmmakers making these types of works. The director Ishii even had an unlikely connection to the genre. His first movie was an unofficial adaptation of Katsuhiro Otomo's manga. Otomo himself would go on to be a seminal voice in Japanese cyberpunk, with works like Akira, which itself was full of rebellious bikers in a near-dystopian version of Japan. It's like Blade Runner and cyberpunk. I think it shared a certain worldwide vision with those, alright? The fact that the comic of Akira and the film versions were accepted overseas might be because they share those images. When does anime come into the picture then? Well, the cyberpunk vision stewed in the industry for a little while. I mean, it takes a little longer to animate after all, until it bled through with works like Megazone 23, an original anime. Now, the rebellious bikers were animated, fighting against a system with the help of a virtual idol stuck in some kind of simulation themselves. It started to come together. Moreover, it sold maybe an estimated 35,000 videotapes. That was a hit, possibly the best-selling OVA of the era. One of their partners would go on to create their own OVA cyberpunk series a couple years later, Bubblegum Crisis. Now that's when you can really see the Blade Runner flowing through the studios. The visual identity is down to the constant night, raining, smog, and contrasting key lights. The metropolis landscape is foundational to the genre. It's the glowing neon city, packed with high-rises like veins leading to its central building, of its mega corporations that erode the liberties of its country, with the inequalities bleeding out into its rundown sections. Blade Runner's approach of the future detective working alongside the authorities, hardboiled stories that were popular. These work reflect that noir setup. These are small little stories, little mysteries often caked in cybernetic blood and sex. Yoshiaki Kawajiri asked the question, what if I were to do Blade Runner, but with a dash of Monkey King? Or what about Cyber City, with its reluctant punks forced to do missions to pay off their overly prosecuted sentences? The connection to crime made it an easy setting for police procedurals. Hard-boiled stories had become pretty popular at that time, when titles such as Bubblegum Crisis expanded into franchises their spin-offs focused on that aspect, with these types of stories getting adapted, following suit. The most absurd of those would definitely be Angel Cop, which while started as some sort of RoboCop ripoff, eventually turned into something much more complex in a web of weird conspiracies. Originally, the writer of the piece, who wrote a fairly in-depth interview after the fact, said that it was supposed to be something that critiqued Japanese geopolitics, the idea of trying to force them into sort of the conflicts around the world at that time, if that be by America or others, or just the fact that they were too reliant on other states because of their lack of a military. Although the screenwriter himself had many disagreements with the director during the production as well as the people who were making it, the producers, so it all kind of got messy, and about halfway through the production he just left. Angel Cop wasn't about rebels or radicals making their own way against the police. It centered around re-institutionalized radicals that now brutally kill left-wing terrorists with the power of the militarized police, creating a continuous loop of never-ending violence. Focusing on the police does sound a little bit opposite to those outsider stories, which were often the type that started cyberpunk. You know, if it wasn't for the anti-Semitism, I'd almost feel that this was supposed to be some sort of biting critique of Japan's crackdown on left-wing groups during the 70s. Ichiro Otani, the director, had commented that maybe he went a little far in a couple places, because he couldn't get work in this area for a couple more decades. There's a level of absurdity to Angel Cop, with the lengths at which the police go to destroy, and how it's all completely played straight. It can really only be rivaled by the comedy series Dominion Tank Police, although that one might be a Saturday morning cartoon in comparison tonally.
Come on, pal, we want the names of the other punks you were with. We're supposed to be out on the beat, keeping the streets safe and clean.
Pay heed to the words of my brother, for it is better to name thy accomplices and have them with thee in prison than to die by grenade.
When it comes to who was the most prolific during this time period, look no further than Masamune Shirow. He had the most adaptations during the 80s. 100%. And originally, he came from a much more average background. He was an art teacher who just happened to put a couple of comics out in a sort of doujin convention style, but then won the science fiction award during the middle of the 80s for his work Appleseed. And from there was a bit of momentum behind his work, a lot of publishing happening, and suddenly even people abroad started to take an interest in his work because they looked at him and thought, these kind of relate more to what was happening in America. They have less things that will make them harder to market, so he suddenly became a lot more popular than you'd expect. And he wasn't the only one. Otomo's Akira was the most successful cyberpunk adaptation of the 80s. Moreover, he directed the anime himself. Otomo's relationship with the anime industry grew when he himself was still relatively a fresh author. He was asked to do character designs for the feature Harmageddon. Over time, with the support of both his mentors, he would move into directing, leading the proposal to create an animated Akira. The year was 1987, and this was around the time of the peak years of cyberpunk's popularity in Japan, with the most discourse surrounding it, which may be why Otomo had these several companies coming together to help him secure the funding for an Akira feature, while also letting him have all that creative freedom. It was advertised as the most expensive anime ever made to try and highlight that spectacle and scale, even though it wasn't strictly true, it was just advertising bullshit. And hey, we'll look at animators from this project, from Madhouse, from Mega23, they're all coming back, and other people in the industry, they were getting whoever they could. Of course, you also had Telecom working on it, although maybe not as many as people would think, because a lot of people at Telecom were still working on the Little Nemo project, so there was a lot of new freelancers coming into the project to try and fill in that space, even if it didn't pay very well. I mean, the scale of the whole feature caused nothing but headaches, not only because of the amount of cuts, but also just the level of skill it needed to capture all that detail. In the end though, it definitely was worth it. The final project was an explosion of kinesthetic action, merging with body horror. Body horror craves your revulsion, to transfix the audience in the uncanny, building a discomfort that you can feel all the way to your stomach, which was all exhibited in the smaller, ugly brother of Akira, Tetsuo Iron Man. A mixture of flesh and metal to the extreme, Tsukamoto didn't intend to make something cyberpunk, but the movie ended up a perfect amalgamation, mixing metal scraps and stop motion to create a deeply unsettling world eroding in front of them, the fear of being consumed by technology or even the consumerism itself. Both Akira and Tetsuo were commodities that became early exports of the genre internationally. Tetsuo had much more success than anyone could have expected, considering it was a very DIY film, with barely enough money to finish it. While Akira's Japanese sales are harder to pin down, I mean seriously it was a nightmare to even find anything remotely close to a reliable source, the international numbers prove it to be a big success. The BBC stated it sold over 70,000 copies in the UK by 1994. Other sources give similar numbers for the States and Europe, which only grew over time, to which it basically created the anime rental market abroad. In a tweet, Bandai's former producer, Watanabe, says that Akira was one of the best-selling anime DVDs in the US during the early years of the 2000s.
While there were other factors in what makes something a popular anime, you gotta think that the sales we're talking about here were just on another level. They could never have expected it. Cyberpunk anime in Japan was a niche upon a niche. It was made for otaku, it was mainly the OVA market. So when you started seeing these kind of numbers, I don't know if they really knew what they were gonna do. I mean, the author himself, Otomo, didn't even expect the manga to leave Japan. Even within the genre, there was only a handful of studios that specialized in it. Manga Video's entire business was built on the back of Akira. They tried to pick up anything for distribution that could be considered remotely close to it, and while they were running thin, they funded their own. Manga Video gave a third of the cost towards Ghost in the Shell, another Shiro adaptation from the animation studio Production IG, a far cry stylistically from the original comic. Its design language is closer to IG's prior movies, like Patlabor 2, in which it shares a large portion of its cast. The Ghost in the Shell movie lacked the manga's humor or characterization, following a more cerebral atmosphere, as unlike Otomo, Shiro didn't have much involvement in his adaptations, with a notable exception being Black Magic. The first anime project I took part in was Black Magic M66. It was really my first, and I was more than happy to put a lot into it, both in time and work. I wrote the script, drew the storyboards, and even sat in on the editing and audio recording. In Ghost in the Shell, IG's team were left to do as they pleased with the project, using the manga as a basis to explore the ideas around cyborgs and AI. These themes are another core part of the cyberpunk experience, especially when dealing with the breakdown between humans and machines, with many cyborg women protagonists. Why is that? Well, Shiro would say it's because he just prefers drawing that kind of thing, although cute girls and robots were very much the selling method of the time for anime. Though it does make them a great example to talk about the Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway, describing cyborgs in media as an offspring of late capitalism and militarism. There's a fear of the invader living amongst people. In Black Magic, the robot is an unstoppable force, a female Terminator before that was actually a reality, which contrasts with Shiro's later characters like Major Kusanagi, who holds a human brain while the rest is artificial. The lines between these things become a bit arbitrary with the rejection of the uniqueness of humans. Haraway argues that everyone has already augmented their bodies in all manner of ways. As she once said, bodies then are not born, they are made. The line between gender, human, and other starts to break down as things can be simulated perfectly. The idea of personhood is quite important in the cyberpunk anime. Metal idol K is tasked with the idea of making 10,000 friends to become human, almost like a cyberpunk retelling of Pinocchio. Although in other works there is a similar sentiment to Ghost in the Shell, where the Major discusses those lines, going as far to merge with the Puppet Master AI in the end, becoming something wholly new. Armitage 3 creates the Third, a style of robot that is so real it is impossible to tell the difference. Often they live in hiding because of prejudice, but the creators went as far as to make it possible for them to have children, playing into some biblical approach. But it also shows in this world that childbearing can be nothing more than just a feature on the box, further degrading if there is much of a difference between the synthetic and human machine. Often these works, intentionally or not, show a level of patriarchy in its creation of female androids.
私のことでしたらお気になさらないでください。私の AI は任務に差し支えない限り、マスターをはじめとする男性からのお誘いをお断りしないよう設定されています。
Or to become sex workers, where they're objectified and worse. Robots as a slave class, one that automates humans out of the market, creating a feud between both groups at the benefit of those on top. An exploitation that can come in direct conflict with self-actualization. In Malistol, the idea of becoming a human leads to new levels of problems that they have to face. It isn't just enough to be human, but it also brings up the good and bad experiences that come with that. To be able to build a self-identity, you must also escape the system of exploitation you are in. If the line between humans and machines is as thin as described, there would be no way that androids will not start to resist the oppression. In Osamu Tezuka's Metropolis, the robot class revolts in the same way that the workers did in the original film. In some instances, the robots can even win against their oppressors and flip the dynamic completely. So let's take a quick break to talk about Mamoru Oshii. Now I'm thinking about doing a series of videos on the man, on this channel and his anime collection, but I want to make sure there's an interest first because it will take a long time. So usually these videos, they get about 4,000 likes, so let's see if we can get at least double that. If we get to 10,000, then that's a real good sign on it, because it will involve talking about a lot of sci-fi and cyberpunk titles, including all the Ghost in the Shell stuff in a bit more detail. And that will go out mainly to the patrons first, probably with some exclusive videos, and I've got to thank a couple of people in this video, of course, while we're in the middle, this short little break. That includes Study of Swords, who gave me a bit of help with the section on hyperreality coming up on part 2, as well as talking about Baudrillard, because he's quite misunderstood by a lot of people on this the site, so I want to talk to someone who really was in the know about it. By the way, there's also a STEVEM's anime corner on Cyberpunk that came with this video, about some of my recommendations, which is on the Patreon as well, so if you enjoy that kind of thing, that's a little bit more casual. But of course, we got to get to the patrons in the end of the day. That includes Lenny, Tim J. Richards, Straphogin, Stratos, Chunks, Jay, Foxwater, OD, Paul, Steam's Mum, Flipsofa, Systematic, Karen, Nick, Doji, Peter, Jaegor, Vic, DTB, Gambaroni, Julius, Roth, Alf, SD, and Mickey Moon. I might have missed you last time, Mickey Moon. I don't know if might have recorded the section at the end before you'd let in, but I digress. Thank you very much everyone involved there, and let's get on to part 2. So let's talk about The Matrix. By the end of the 90s, Japanese cyberpunk had kind of become part of the pool of the influence of new American filmmakers, such as the people behind The Matrix, who were very inspired by anime. The siblings themselves were yearning to make some kind of anime in the Matrix universe, and Warner Brothers made that a reality.
What is the Animatrix?
Coming from some of their favourite creators, if that be Koji Morimoto or Shinichiro Watanabe, although working in Hollywood came with its own problems. So when I went to Las Vegas for the recording sessions, I told the team that if I saw that producer, I would punch him in his face. The producer ended up not coming to the recording, which is unheard of. There was a fight to hold on to any team vision. Both the very existence of it was proof that American producers had caught onto the potential market and were looking for ways to take advantage. Even when we get outside of Hollywood, the anime cyberpunk titles kind of stayed within their conventions. That would be the police procedurals, the sidekicks, and just the allure of Blade Runner. They still couldn't escape it, even all these years later. Even now they were on the Billboard 100. But during the early 2000s, there were definitely projects that were moving away from that and finding their own aesthetic. Originally a manga by Tsutomu Nihei, the world it inhabits is a fractured maze of metallic structures, really focusing on the feeling of isolation that only seems to expand further out in this mangled path. The author's prior career as an architect does come into play in making these impossible structures feel possible. They are all that's left in this very empty world outside of these synthetic people who are trying to kill them. It isn't sexy in the same way or as tantalizing as, say, Mead's drawings. In fact, it looks a little closer to something that would give you a tetanus shot. There's likely more Giga influence here. Giga's popularity in Japan is high, thousands of people showing up for his first exhibition, and also that's where he had his first fan club. All that popularity did stem originally from Alien, and his style was often replicated in 80s anime. Giga-esque piles of bones, biometric mechanical devices, tubes with transparent worm larvae. It was all there. From games to anime, especially in cyberpunk, they all leaned into this for the body horror experience. In the 2000s, Blame had its first anime adaptation by Group TAC. It wasn't a cohesive retelling, but small fragments in this shattered landscape, little shorts, which instill a charm of showing stuff that keeps the mystery in its dark atmosphere, retaining its rougher edges as well, emphasizing these one-tone, digitally fried landscapes. Even in Production IG's CGI version of the shorts, it's true to the spirit. Blame may be closer to a childhood Neuromancer, if anything, as the author was a big fan of Gibson's hacker-style stories. Speaking of hackers, that's not unlike Lane, an anime original produced by Taro Maki and Yasuyuki Ueda. who tend to be people that go out to find more unique stories to fund. While Shibuya's Blade Runner town is featured at the beginning of each episode, the haze of lights and shadowy figures make it move into something a lot more claustrophobic, telephone poles replacing the arteries of buildings. Server rooms that turn into giga monstrosities. A blackness of blood splatter follows the characters everywhere, with a searing brightness and buzzing that infects everything. It's a piece that merges both analog and digital together in its presentation, enhancing itself as something bigger than the sum of its parts. The focus here is on the virtual, the wired, as it's referred, a ways of making connections with people. It's both tantalizing but also pulls you into a dark place. Kosaka wrote this outline. As a defining voice of cyberpunk anime, he's wrote quite a fair bit, and he knows his conspiracy rabbit holes, I'll tell you that much, as he merges the real and the fabricated at the same time, blurring what is real or not, or if there's a difference at all.
Hyperreality was a theory established by Jean Baudrillard, who basically came up with it around the same time as the rise of cyberpunk. They're often connected together because of that factor. And a decade later, in Japan, the wired and virtual worlds had become basically mainstream through internet cafes and other means. Hyperreality would argue that this modern age, there is no line between reality and the virtual, similar to how Cyberpunk Manifesto removes the distinction between machines and humans. Often there is a distinct feeling in the media that the dystopian world is compromised and it is better to stay in the wired world. The reality side is irrelevant, often disappointing in comparison, even if the virtual can kill you. If that's a cyber virus that infects people, or through the amount of information processed, which becomes incomprehensible, you can create disinformation campaigns. It's post-truth, where the verification process becomes too obtuse. There is no truth. That's not really what's important here, as much as it is the effect. Hyperreality is considered realer than the regular, not because there's a difference, it's the same world, opposed to the common misconception created by the Matrix that splits it in two. Often you'll see those two worlds even in anime. While in Paprika you can access the virtual through your dreams, once you go in, it becomes an escapist fantasy, and it also becomes almost impossible to tell if you ever left the dream to begin with. To get a closer lack of the distinction, we need the cybernetic brain. With Real Dive, a series that was also first conceptualized by Shiro, we see a complete picture of how the wired experience could change people's relationship with the world, or help people experience things that their bodies can no longer do. To act out one's personal fantasy, and yeah, I'm talking about the sex ones. It takes a neutral opinion on the virtual, but it also sees the danger in corporate oversight, infecting people's minds and dreams, possibly rewriting their interests to sell you something, is scarier than most ghost stories. Once you've truly corporatized a virtual space, you end up with something like Denocoil. What if these virtual spaces exist in the same space as the physical? In a literal sense, augmented reality, a Disneyland version of the Japanese city, where we all have to put on our glasses. These glasses add a new level of connectivity and convenience, a true cyborg future, but communications are not inherently relations. Even the lines of what counts as relationships change as virtual pets become just as viable as the real ones. With hyperreal pets, it shows the systems they aren't worth splitting hairs about, proving that these virtual things are no more real to us than the physical ones. They both are constructed forms of reality we have created, like humans and cyborgs. Although Denocoil's AR still lacks a physical touch, there is some distinction there. Ghost in the Shell Innocence may be the closest to representing hyperreality in an anime film. The film argues that you can't really trust your own perception in an age of cyberbrains, if you ever could to begin with. You can be hacked, your memories can be implanted. If you escape a simulation trap or not is impossible to know. Innocence delves into the philosophical and esoteric, deeper than the prior movie, despite its status as a sequel to a massively successful original. It went against the widening of the net to consumers. When we look at the early theorists writing on virtual reality, it feels a bit naive to today's standards, with utopian visions of how art and artists will shape the future of these devices, and their true potential, instead of the obviously defined cynical profit margins. During the 2000s, Ghost in the Shell was becoming an entire brand because of its popularity. That movie a little bit too heady for you? Well, why don't you try this different adaptation? There's a different vibe here. Have a go with Standalone Complex, which they would brag to be the most expensive anime ever made in 2002. The 2000s were the peak of the anime cyberpunk boom. From the 80s to the 90s to 2000, we've seen a slow up curve the whole time, and the 2000s also had the most original IPs. While Shiro's projects and adaptations only rose by that time, Otomo seemed absent, as he left the genre as a director. While he didn't release a fully animated feature in the 90s, he would still work alongside people who created cyberpunk anime. which would continue all the way into the 2000s. Yet his sights had moved to a different genre, steampunk. Steam Boy was a high-budget family animation, trying to compensate for the change in the market. Ghibli was booming, showing numbers that we've never seen before at the box office for anime revenue. The potential return was now in family movies, opposed to those underground genre works he'd rose upon. But Steam Boy didn't perform, and Otomo hasn't himself completed another theatrical animation, nor cyberpunk animation since. The closest work is probably going to be the cyberpunk-y Freedom, which was a CGI animation project from the mid-2000s. Based on some of his character designs and mechanical works, it was twice as expensive as a 2D production, but only needed half the team, and it found its money in part by being funded by Cup Noodle, as it was an anniversary campaign, so eat up. Hey, it even won an advertising award at the ADC. It doesn't sound very punk in any fashion though, but I suppose when you look at the amount of people and money and production committees that are involved in anime, none of it sounds very punk at all. Freedom's fine as an OVA, it's a fine little story about rebellion and going for the truth, but it's also a lot more affable than Akira, softer. Japanese cyberpunk as a punk genre had pretty much waned by the 2000s among these types of anime titles. The genre wasn't looking great in the late 2000s because of the crash of the market. There had been calls for the death of cyberpunk since the beginning of the 90s in America, but anime kept it going a little bit longer. With every boom there was a bust. The market around it had just simply changed. The studios that used to specialize in it were no longer doing well or were bankrupt, or you might have situations where, say for example Madhouse, the founder had left and the kind of projects they were making were not quite as ambitious as they used to be. While the 2010s definitely sees a slump in numbers, they're not completely gone, but there is a good portion of them coming from two specific franchises, both from Production IG, as science fiction kind of work had become part of their brand. That's how this kind of business works, right? I mean, when it comes to like a novel or a manga, you really just got to convince that editor to some degree. It's like, hey, let me have a shot. The production costs are nothing in comparison to animation scale, people, amount of production committees and companies that need to come together just to get one show made, especially during a period where there are staff shortages and there are problems within the industry for sure. And that is generally why animation cyberpunk has been always mainly adaptations of different popular works. So for example, Blame finally got an anime movie. That's great, right? Well, not really. It's very different from the source material. I would say more commercial might be the word. Adapting the story that, to be fair, was not exactly the easiest thing to do, but they changed the foundation of the text in some ways. The CG animation isn't exactly the problem necessarily, but there are more characters and it loses some of its uniqueness, its edge. The presentation and audio are far more conventional, and the flavour it was trying to appeal to prior is just not there in the same way. Throughout the 2010s, there was a slow but steady change for cyberpunk. Everything old is new again. Cyberpunk becomes a byproduct of American nostalgia. A new resurgence with sequels and attempts to even create your own anime adaptations. Most of them didn't do too well. Like The Matrix before, it also became an idea of the anime spin-off. If that be Blade Runner or Altered Carbon, you can use a cyberpunk anime to make your existing series seem more authentic to that genre. These titles will start popping up on new mediums like streaming. ONAs and their streaming companies had a potential to fund new series. We see a revival of Standalone Complex, although with mixed reception. But the biggest success during this period would be cyberpunk edgerunners. While cyberpunk will build worlds lacking boundaries between humans and machines, also there is an erasure of national borders culturally. A production like Edgerunners on its face reflects it, an American tabletop game turned into a Polish video game, then adapted by a Japanese company for an American streaming network. Oh yeah, and that tabletop was also vaguely inspired by anime. It's a classical hacker-style story for the genre, corporate greed and the contrast of different classes at the forefront. But its release was 2 years after the video game. It was a distant memory for many, especially with its minor delay to September. But it came out the gate with both acclaim and high ratings on Netflix, top 10 in the world for international series. You know, it was a big success and it almost makes you forget about all the labor problems it was having with exploitation, or that the game released completely unfinished after so much time and money was put into it. Forget about that. We got a new patch out and now you can go to all the places that are mentioned in the Edgerunner show. You remember that song? Isn't it sad now that you know where the context comes from? And hey, ooh, look at what's that? Is that a shotgun? Ooh, woohoo! Don't think, just consume. I mean, at the end of the day, no amount of bad press is going to stop a game that was this popular. It sold 30 million copies in only 3 years. That puts anime's popularity into perspective. It is nothing in comparison to the giant that this had become. The characters and edgerunners could not break past the structures that held them in place, and the ending holds on to that helpless feeling. That even these rebels, there's only so far they can push. Rarely in anime do we ever see a title that tries to speak truth to power. I mean, they're rebels, not revolutionaries after all. Well, as Baudrillard would say, there is no revolution possible in the simulation. Let's talk about Genocidal Organ, a post-9/11 work about the war on terror, the slow disillusionment of the American military-industrial complex, and its imperialism throughout the world, which keeps itself sustained, virtual abstraction in the crimes they commit, echoing the Lawnmower Man or a first-person shooter game, as you can see literal retica markers wherever they commit war crimes. The soldiers are drugged and augmented to make the process easy. There is no reaction, no feeling, no reality here, only hyperreality. There was a lecture given on postmodernism by Rick Roderick, which discussed the idea of a conversation with a Gulf War veteran. The pilot said that flying his plane and dropping bombs was just like a video game in the arcade. To them, there was no better training. Baudrillard once argued that if anything is real, war is. It's a very salient point, but he also argued during the time of the Gulf War, there was a sort of virtualization of war as we know it. It became unreal. The enemy has disappeared. War is not directed at the enemy. The war itself was directed against reality itself, informed by the glow of a television. The only difference now is the size of the screen. War has changed. It's no longer about nations, ideologies, or ethnicity. It's an endless series of proxy battles fought by mercenaries and machines. War, and its consumption of life, has become a well-oiled machine. This is a quote from Metal Gear Solid 4. Project Ito wrote the novelization of the game. Ito himself was a Metal Gear Solid fan fiction writer. He was influenced by the heart of Hideo Kojima's writing style. It's as subtle as a brick, but he's also able to emulate the MGS experience down to the infographic speeches given to the protagonists. Ito's stories then went on to influence the direction of the Metal Gear series. The video game has started to emulate the fan, as reality starts to emulate the games. But in the hyperreal sense, Metal Gear Solid is no less real than any modern war, even if war is no less atrocious. War in Genocidal Organ is just as obscured. The targets are abstract and individual. One day you have a mission that could be assassinating a foreign president, or go halfway across the world to do some spying. All backdrops in a mission select, committed by playable cyborgs. War has become a game. The ending of Genocidal Organ is an attempt to change the system that be, having a member of the US military going in front of Congress as a whistleblower. It may sound familiar, but Genocidal Organ was written in 2006 by a Japanese person. They had no experience in the US military. His knowledge is coming third hand through the media he consumes. Genocidal Organ itself originally was written as a Snatcher fan fiction before it was expanded.
I'm prepared to protect my world. A world where I can order a jalapeno pizza and pay for it with my ID thumbprint. Where I can throw away half my Big Mac just because I'm full and I want to. But it's bullshit, Williams. It's all a lie! So what if it is? It's our bullshit. It's too late. We're committed to it.
People would rather ignore the horrors. They want something better than true. It doesn't matter if it's true, it just has to be satisfying. Blowing the whistle will not change the system, but that's not Shepard's plan. Shepard's decision is to use the Genocidal Organ against the US for the safety of the rest of the world. It's a post-apocalyptic sentiment, but in Baudrillard's readings, the post-apocalypse is already here. It's just nobody noticed. Shepard has only opened his eyes. Just as we see reality in this fake version of the United States, so did Japan see a whole lot of reality in the fake Japan and Asia, which inspired a lot of his works. There's a little distinction in hyperreality, and in the modern day, all those hypotheticals and cautionary tales in cyberpunk are just happening in real time, even if in real life the images are not quite as tantalizing as we'd hoped. Like I said before, almost disappointing in comparison. Cyberpunk anime will continue, even if it isn't as big as it used to be, as long as there are passionate people who are inspired. Those who might be willing to potentially bankrupt the whole studio to make sure something gets done. Say for example with Pluto, which took about 10 years to make. But they will all be immortalized in the virtual. And I will catch you next time. See you, Space Cowboy. Yeah, I know I didn't talk about that one. I don't know if I actually count it as cyberpunk or not. But that's a conversation for a different day.